Alan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Why don't we start with your background, your career, where you started, the kind of the different things that you've done over your career, and then, what you're doing now.
Well, much of my career has been centered around budgeting, and that interest began accidentally or fortuitously in 1957 when I took a graduate course at Yale University, taught by Charles Lindblom. And his interest that year was, how does society collectively make rational decisions? The field of economics focused on how individuals make rational choice. And he wanted to broaden it to the question of, can we collectively make rational decisions? And his interest drawn to budgeting because it is a formal effort to rationalize decisions with respect to money. Whether successful or not was another matter, but that engaged me in budgeting. I then went ahead and did a dissertation on budgeting. At that time, my focus was on state budgeting, and I did a dissertation comparing budget practices and policies in 8 states. And since I was a graduate student, I went hopped from one bus to another to the 8 states. Then over time, I moved ahead to United States budgeting. And again, by good fortune, a bounce of the ball, I ultimately became involved in budgeting around the world. And just to give you a few statistics, I've worked in 45 of the 50 states, and I've worked in more than 60 countries. But around that, I've been a teacher my whole life. That's where I've seen myself. For 38 years, I taught at the University of Maryland. I began my teaching career in 1961 at Tufts University. And in between those 2 teaching gigs, if I might say, I worked at a think tank, the Brookings Institution. That's what brought me to Washington. And then for 6 or 7 years, I worked for the United States Congress. And it so happened that I became the principal author of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, although some of my friends think I should disown any patronage for it because after all, it hasn't worked out quite the way people had hoped. I have one other thought about budgeting, and my kids asked me once why I got into budgeting, and I said 3 reasons. Every government does it. They do it every year. They never get it right, and therefore I'll never be unemployed. So that's the jocular reason as to why I got involved in budgeting. But I may say that budgeting has taken me well beyond that to the issue of how countries develop. In fact, my last teaching responsibility is mostly on why some countries develop and others don't. It's taken me to institutions like Congress and the presidency, and not bounded simply by money issues. And that's one of the delights of budgeting, that it radiates to so many aspects of both policy and institutions.
Fantastic. And why don't we start then, with a very kind of top-down topic, which is the philosophy of budgeting. Now, I hear a lot about how budgeting is done or not done in Congress today, or et cetera, but I kind of go back to the first question of the structure of the budgeting question. A business has a certain kind of set of goals when it budgets, right?
Yeah.
And you would think that the Congress, when it's looking at the US budget, has a different set of goals. From a top-down point of view, what is the framework that is used to think about the budget when it comes to the US?
Okay. Budgeting in government is fundamentally different than budgeting in business. It's much more prominent in government than in business. In business, the key questions are not how much money you're spending, but product development, marketing, having clients, having a cash flow. And budget is subservient to these interests. In business, furthermore, you essentially must have a variable budget. That is, a budget is variable because you don't know what your income will be, you don't know what your marketing will be. If GM was going to say we're budgeting for 1 million cars, and they sell only 500,000 cars, and therefore they underspend their budget, they save, no one is going to applaud them. So business budgeting inherited is variable. In government, however, budgeting is fixed because it becomes a legal limit and authorization on government taxation and expenditure. The very fact that budgeting is fixed limits the capacity to budget on the one hand, but blows up its prominence. Because after all, if it's a fixed budget, it's at that point in time deciding what next year's spending and next year's revenues will be.
So that makes a lot of sense to me. Now, what if we take it down a level and think about the way individuals compartmentalize this budget or view the budget? So on the revenue side, we have taxation and different types of taxation, right? Different ways to collect revenues, right? And on the other side, there are fundamentally different ways to spend money. You know, so for instance, if I'm going to raise revenues, I can decide to do it through taxing incomes or assets or through fees or through state-owned corporations, right? There's lots of ways I could conceptualize raising revenues. How does the government approach those questions?
Government approaches it incrementally. A business might ask the question, what markets should we enter next year? What markets should we exit next year? Governments begin with a different question. What obligations are we carrying forward from last year to next year? In the literature on budgeting, this is called incrementalism. Okay. On both the tax and the revenue side, what are the incremental, or relatively small changes that we want to make in the budgeting? Now, the increments can be enlarged, as in the case with President Biden right now. The increments are much larger than they were in the previous decade or two. But nevertheless, relative to what we call the base, what the government was spending last year, the increment will end up to be relatively small. So it turns out, paradoxically, that while a government's budget looks forward, it's incumbent to look backwards. What happened last year, in a significant degree, determines what will happen next year.
So that's really using the previous year as the benchmark to which we're making some kind of minor change based on whatever priorities are out there or change in the environment, right?
Yeah.
But you could conceive in theory about other ways to do it. I mean, like, for instance, when I think about the expenditure side, you know, there are different kinds of expenditures. Like there's defense, you know, there's, you know, socials programs. There's even a category you might call redistribution, right? Now, some of these kinds of expenditures could be benchmarked against some ideal. So for instance, you could say, okay, I think your average American is willing to redistribute 15% or 5% of their income. And so why don't we benchmark our taxation and spending according to that benchmark, rather than this kind of incremental strategy? Now, has that kind of thing ever been thought of in government, or is it totally crazy?
The answer is yes, and it still might be crazy, okay, or undoable. And that actually opens the door to the question that I failed to address before. Is there any philosophy to budgeting? Okay, and I'll give you 3 takes on it. Okay, the dominant, if you study budgeting, you notice that in virtually all governments, there's a restlessness about it, seeking a better way. To budget is always to reform. And in budgeting for the United States government, there's a parade of budget reforms, program budgeting, performance-based budgeting, planning program budgeting system, management by objectives, zero-based budgeting. It's a long parade. So there's one philosophy of budgeting which says, yes, we can rationalize choice. On the other side of the ledger, there's a incrementalist voice that says incrementalism is not only the way government budgets are made, but it's the way budgets should be made. In other words, incrementalism can be both a description of budget practice and a norm of good government behavior, budgetary behavior. And you may have heard about Aaron Wildavsky, the leading advocate of this idea that budgeting ought to be comfortable within its incremental skin. Nothing wrong with it. It's rational. It reduces conflict. It reduces the burden of calculation. It enables you to make budgets again and again. There's a third voice, which is almost identical to the question that you phrased. And it was articulated about 30 years ago by a distinguished economist. Unfortunately, nobody seconded his motion. The economist was Herbert Stein. He's famous for Stein's law that if a trend can't continue, it won't. Okay. Stein actually published a book which said budgets ought to be allocated as shares of national income. What portion of national income do you want to spend on health, on defense, on other social purposes? Okay. The objection to that was really interesting. It opens the door to a form of central planning. And it's a door that people did not want to have opened. That if you think all you're doing is allocating budgetary shares to actually implement a budget in which shares are allocated by function or by objective or by purpose, requires that you tunnel deep into the operation of the economy and society to govern human behavior. So I think that's the reason why that third voice by Herbert Stein did not gain much currency.
So, but there are some kinds of ways that it's thought through, like defense, for instance, maybe comes to mind, or even some of the social programs, which are kind of formulaic in their creation, right? And do have some kind of benchmark to societal numbers, so some kind of societal or economic numbers. So it seems that there's some attempt to do that, but it's not a comprehensive kind of approach.
Well, actually, for an extended period of time until a couple of months ago, there was an unwritten understanding that the amount appropriated for defense each year should be approximately equal to the amount appropriated for domestic purposes each year. Now, that's not the whole of budgeting, because there's a third category, which is payments to individuals, the various transfer payments, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. There are dozens of those programs, and they, in fact, account for almost, together with interest payments, almost 2/3 of federal spending. But with respect to the amount that Congress actually votes each year, there was an unwritten rule. How do I know it was a rule? Because year after year, the two sets of numbers, defense and non-defense appropriations, pretty much converge.
You know, it's interesting when you call it a rule, although it's an unwritten rule. It reminds me of budgeting before the 1920s, right? That I think you've written about, where balances, budgets were typically balanced in the United States before the 20s. So, they go out of whack during a war or an emergency, but then they would be clawed back over time. And so typically there was at least a norm around this balanced budget, and that norm eroded, right? It seems in the 20s. Is that an accurate characterization?
That is accurate. It didn't erode in the 20s, it eroded in the 30s. But now we have something called modern monetary theory, which introduces another perspective on this. Deficits are good for you. In other words, you identify two stages of this evolution: a balanced budget norm, unwritten but powerful, okay? Accepting deficits to stabilize the economy. That's from the 30s until relatively recently. And now we've opened the door, at least a crack, to a new version which says try deficits, they're good for you. As long as government is borrowing in its own currency, there's no limit to how much government can borrow. There's no limits on deficits. We're scrolling back to the topic of this discussion raises an interesting question. Budgeting inherently is a means of rationing resources. If modern monetary theory is right, we no longer have to ration resources.
It's a very good, it's Keynes to the next level.
Yeah.
But
well, the final chapter on monetary theories has not been written yet.
so in terms of the, if we look at this concept of debt and deficits, and even on the flip side, which would be surpluses, I mean, who knows if that'll ever happen again, but let's just say that there's the possibility of the budget going out of balance. Now I can understand a legislature taxing and spending at an equal, and balancing a budget. When it runs a deficit or runs a surplus, to me, that creates a situation where, at least in the set system of the deficit where there's a debt, you're creating future obligations on a future legislature, right? And it would seem to me that there's less representation of that future constituency in the current Congress, right? And so it's easy to impose costs on the future than it is on the group today. And so if my theory of representation is that I'm supposed to represent people today and maximize their benefits, then it's rational for me to borrow from the future as much as possible.
You're absolutely right.
Right. So in a sense, they're acting rationally. And the only way to avoid that problem would be to impose additional costs to do so, right? Make it more expensive to borrow, or get a higher threshold of votes in order to make a more solid decision, if you will, to borrow.
That's not the approach that we've taken. The approach is to say that we establish a budget constraint. And the purpose of the budget constraint is to accomplish precisely, or to avert what you were concerned about, that we would undertake obligations this year, which, because of the incremental momentum of budgeting, continue on to generations in the future. Those future generations have no voice in the decision. They are therefore unrepresented, and that violates basic norms of democracy. And consequently, what we do is impose a budget constraint. What we've seen recently is the budget constraints don't seem to matter very much. In two ways, they don't matter much. Both Republican and Democratic politicians have breached the norm. Okay, Trump certainly, when he was president, and Biden as well, in different ways. They have different objectives and priorities with both of them. And the second motive is interest rates are so low. It's costless to borrow today. Will it be costless to borrow in the future? Probably not. But as you pointed out, that future is voiceless.
I think it's interesting that there used to be this norm around balanced budgets, and that norm eroded, right? And it seems to me it exposed the basic machinery of the Constitution that doesn't have this protection against against the future. It's almost like there's an inherent bias towards borrowing, right? That was resisted by culture in the past, but that culture eroded. And so the basic machinery, the basic logic would be to borrow to the maximum.
Right.
So what kind of processes or procedures or systems could we impose that would neutralize this bias? Like, for instance, we ask the president now to make a budget, or we have a budget committee that comes up with a number. are there other ways that you've thought through or that you've seen through states or other countries or whatever that could mitigate this kind of this natural bias towards taking from the future at low cost?
Yeah, let me mention two ways that countries have considered this question, not always successfully. One is every year to construct a long-term budget, not a projection, but a long-term budget. And therefore, when you take initiative, when you make decisions this year, ask yourself, what is the consequence, given what assumptions you're using, for budgetary balance, revenue and expenditure, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, okay? And to bar politicians from making decisions today which have an adverse budgetary impact at some time in the future. Okay, this is a simple, elegant solution. It has only one major weakness. This rule has to be enforced by the people who want to violate the rule. Okay. Now, there's a second method, which is actually the economic obverse of this, and that is, you would know this from business. What is the present value of future obligations? In other words, you improve Medicare for all, for example, which is on the table, okay? And you construct a baseline extending N years into the future, and you have a budget neutrality constraint saying that you cannot take any decisions with respect to the future whose present value would add to the deficit. Okay. And that's an approach which is economists are very comfortable with because they speak the language of discounting and net present value. But again, it would have to be enforced by the people who are pressured to make the decisions in the first place.
And when you talk about the rule, the rules that would be imposed, right? You know, have there been thoughts about increasing the proportion or the margin required to take on these debts? You know, like you want to take debt that's 5 years long, well, it's a majority. You know, you want in debt that's going to be paid back in 10 years, well, then you need 2/3. And you want it to be 20 years, then it needs to be 4/5. You know, some kind of logic to this idea that the farther out the impact, the greater the majority required in order to do that borrowing.
Yeah, and that's possible, and it can be applied in multiple ways, not only with respect to the future impact of current budget decisions, but to all budget decisions. For example, there's some states, United States, that actually require supermajority in order to raise taxes. They generally don't have a similar majority to do. Let me point out one big problem with this method. You know how divided Congress is. You know how tense and polarized the situation is. Okay, the course that you just recommended will not lead to decision, but to paralysis. In other words, what you suggested is potentially workable when the two parties work together. But given the fact that they're so distant today from each other, and that they have no interest or minor interest in cooperating, one party doesn't want to make life easy for the other party, that any rule other than rule by majority might lead to paralysis.
Well, in the case of what I'm discussing, it might lead more towards budgets that would only last, 4 years or 2 years, for instance, because they could only squeak out a majority. They couldn't obligate. But you're right. It's already the norm that so much is borrowed every year that it would lead to paralysis. You're right.
But beyond that, let's assume, for example, that Congress this year or next adopts one of the objectives of progressive Democrats. Either a public option for Medicare, which means that individuals can voluntarily enroll in Medicare below the age of 65, or Medicare for all. Okay. Now, if we undertake that, even if we put a time limit on it, it's really not time limited, because scroll ahead, it's a 5-year program. Okay. At the end of 5 years, there would be political turmoil if you tried to terminate it. Okay. We've had numerous experiences. This is only temporary, which is kind of a calming medication. Don't worry about it. But when you create something which is temporary, you've created expectations and demands which are not temporary.
Well, it goes back to that. That's certainly the case if you take an incremental philosophy according to budgeting, right? Because you're taking the previous as a given, as something legitimate, rather than thinking it through from the beginning each year.
That's right. That's right. The problem that you're raising could have been asked in the 1920s, the 50s, the 80s, etc. But it's more compelling today because of the fact that governments are already much larger than they used to be. There's significant resistance to tax increases. If you notice, Biden has constructed tax increases which are focused on a tiny sliver of the population, not simply because they're rich, that's true enough, but also because it means that 95% or whatever percent of the population don't have to pay for additional benefits. This is the world that we're in today, that it's a much more difficult budgetary situation. In fact, in social democracies, which is the model that some progressives are now using that we aspire to, they face a critical problem. Government spending is already well above 50% of the national economy. How much higher could it be? A recent book I haven't hop and skip away from me called Bigger Government, written by a specialist who's stationed in Switzerland, says, just consider healthcare costs because of technological change and climate change. Those two forces, not demographics, leaves that out, not because of aging the population, but changes in the practice of medicine, okay, and climate change will add 5% of spending relative to GDP over the next generation or so in advanced economies, including the United States. So we really are going to face some of the choices, some of the issues that you've been dealing with. Okay. The issues seem to be perennial. Scroll back any generation, even the 1820s, when government was tiny. People said it can't grow bigger, can't grow bigger. Well, it has grown bigger, a lot bigger. And when it grows to this stage, we really have to ask a question about where we're headed in the future.
I'm curious if we take a little step back to the taxation question, because income tax, graduated income tax started, I think, at the beginning of the 20th century, around that time. I'm curious on your opinion on it, on taxation and the philosophy of taxation, I should call it, I guess, where, obviously it all started with tariffs in the earliest days, right? And then income tax has become, the one of the primary means. And then there's the concept of asset tax. Do you have a particular view on what the ideal mix of taxes are, or at least, I don't want to say the word fair, but a kind of a uniform, simplified tax structure that would be, I guess, universal in the way that the current tax scheme doesn't seem to be?
Well, I have a few answers. One is with respect to the current tax system. it is punched through with so many loopholes, so many carve-outs. And we're conducting this interview a day after the newspapers revealed that 25 of the richest taxpayers in the United States paid very little by way of taxes legally. That was the remarkable thing. Okay, I've been to countries where the tax form was one page. It boils down to this: how much did you make? This is the divisor, and this is what you pay. Okay, not all the exemptions, the deductions, the carve-outs, the deferrals, etc. Okay, that would be a great benefit to the United States, but almost impossible to get through Congress. Okay, the second point I want to make is that almost congenitally, Americans have an aversion to taxation that you don't see in other countries. In the book I wrote some years ago, I have the line that we rebelled against the British because we didn't like taxation without representation. Now we don't like taxation with representation. We don't like it. And in fact, the statistics are true. More than half of American households do not pay federal income taxes, but survey polls show that they believe that they do pay federal income taxes. And this is a big problem for us. Every country in the world which has a large public sector has also either what's called a VAT, a value-added tax, or goods and service tax, GST tax. This is off the table in the United States. Any politician who would propose it is ending his career simply by proposing a value-added tax. And yet, it makes a great deal of sense to do so, but it's politically untenable. Okay. A friend of mine once quipped as follows: we'll get a value-added tax only under the following circumstances. The Democrats support it because it generates a lot of income, and Republicans support it because everybody pays for it.
So I think of a value-added tax as a kind of transaction tax, right? And you're taxing all transactions pretty much.
But taxation only with respect to consumption goods.
Well, okay, so more like a sales tax.
Ultimately, because even though it's imposed on every stage of transaction, it's a tax on consumption.
Right. So there's that kind of tax. Then there's an income tax, and then there's an asset tax, right?
Right.
So it seems to me that your feeling is that this transaction tax or value-added tax would be a more ideal tax than an income or an asset. Is that right?
No. I apologize. A value-added tax can work only together with an income tax because it cannot generate a sufficient amount of income. What you call an asset tax has had a revival recently by the label of wealth tax. Okay, and it is gaining currency. It's gaining support. I don't know enough about it. What I've read is that countries that tried it abandoned it because of various complications. Particularly, how do you value a privately owned business? How do you value a farm? How do you value a home? And these valuations can be controversial, complex, etc. Obviously, publicly traded assets have a public value to them. Okay? I think what we might settle for, given the climate we're in, is for some form of asset tax on people who really have an extraordinary amount of assets. For want of a better label, I'll call it a billionaire's tax. It will not solve the deficit problem of the United States, but it will solve political problems for politicians.
Yeah, because I wonder about, first of all, there is, of course, the property tax, which is a kind of asset tax on a state level in most states, right? So they get at the issue a little bit, but you're right. In that case, it's easier to do a valuation, right? And then peg a percentage of that valuation. And I also wonder about in Europe, right? You may have some old families, right? They have a lot of assets, but very little income. They don't pay any taxes.
Right.
You wonder whether those assets, which are being kind of backed by the state to a certain extent, because they're consuming resources of the state in order to make sure that those assets are protected, those property is protected, but they're not paying tax for that service. So you can understand some kind of logic behind the asset tax.
Okay. Well, one form of asset is digital, and the state I live in, Maryland, the past year became the first state to adopt a digital tax. And I will tell you, for tax collectors, good news travels very fast. And so they're looking to see how the courts rule with respect to this new form of taxation and how much revenue it generates. And if it turns out to be a fertile form of taxes, it will spread very quickly. And the question will be whether it spreads only to the state level or to the federal level as well.